Good morning, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Mark McClellan.
Great. Thanks very much, Garrett. Good morning and welcome to this hybrid public workshop on building quality into the design and conduct of clinical studies, integrating quality by design, QBD, and risk-based monitoring, RBM approaches. I'm sorry I'm not with you there for those of you who are joining us from DC, and also want to thank all of you who are joining online for this very important and timely meeting. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. And actually, as we get started with this very important and timely meeting, I have an update to share. Today, right about now, Duke University is announcing that the Margolis Center is officially being elevated to the Duke Margolis Institute for Health Policy. This university action to elevate our status into a permanent Duke Institute is an important acknowledgement of our mission, our work, Duke's leadership in health policy, a recognition of the importance of our efforts through the kinds of collaborations that we're doing today with all of you to bring diverse perspectives and expertise together to address challenging healthcare issues. A critical part of this work relates to strengthening clinical trials and the valuable evidence that they can produce. So clinical trials are the backbone of the approval process for drugs and biologics. These trials enable demonstration of the safety and efficacy of a product for its indicated use, and the generation of high quality, high integrity data underlying that, while ensuring participants' safety is the top priority for sponsors and regulators. But along with these goals, the increasing cost and administrative steps associated with clinical trials have become a driving factor in making drug development more expensive, which complicates bringing better treatments to patients for unmet needs. Despite technological and operational advancements and an increasingly strong regulatory science and evidence foundation, important work remains in modernizing clinical trial design and conduct to fully reflect the core concepts of risk-based management, RBM. Concepts including RBM and quality by design, QBD, facilitate clinical trial modernization by enhancing efficiency of risk management. The application of QBD to clinical trials was spearheaded by leaders like Janet Woodcock, who were inspired in turn by work being done to improve the quality in the manufacturing of medical products themselves, best practices and procedures driven by science in the manufacturing process applied to the equally, if not more complex standards and processes of clinical trials. Utilization of these concepts has helped assure that quality is centered throughout the life cycle of clinical development without compromising data integrity or participant safety, and also to lay out a path forward for further steps to improving quality, efficiency, and risk management in study design. In recent years, both regulators and industry stakeholders have focused on the principles and applications of QBD and RBM to improve clinical studies and drug development. And this workshop features some of the consequences of all of that progress with leading experts and interested stakeholders that have demonstrated the ability to successfully implement QBD and RBM principles into the design and execution of their trials. This work builds off a 2019 workshop also co-convened by Duke Margolis and the FDA on improving implementation of risk-based monitoring in clinical studies. Going back further, you may recall that the 2012 President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology report on propelling innovation in drug discovery, development, and evaluation, including reference to numerous efforts for incorporating quality in clinical trial design and execution, also contributed to these ideas. And of course, before that, there was the foundational work of the QBD, around QBD from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, the public-private partnership founded by FDA and Duke University. And we're thrilled to have both the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative City and numerous contributors for that and early work participating with us today. And then even preceding that, I recall Janet Woodcock's leadership on the concepts behind these topics in manufacturing and clinical trial design as part of the Critical Path Initiative launched at FDA when I was the commissioner. So a lot of history to draw on and a lot of progress. And presenters and panelists throughout the workshop will include representatives from industry sponsors, CROs, additional third-party providers, academics, regulators, some FDA participants as well. Throughout the discussion, we'll be hearing about both the implementation successes over the past 15 plus years in these efforts, but also the remaining challenges, both real and perceived, so that we can hopefully identify ways to accelerate this important progress. It's our sincere hope and expectation, based on the numerous case study examples that will be shared today, that many in the clinical trial community are going to feel empowered, get some insights from these examples to utilize these practical learnings, tools, to increase confidence and adoption of these approaches for coming clinical trials. Increased adoption of QBD and RBM approaches not only serves to increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials, but also hopefully will make progress on increasing their efficiency and reducing their costs and time. The meeting today is therefore going to be a success if we have some robust discussion of all of these case examples and learnings during our sessions. And those sessions are going to include opportunities for everyone there, all of our audience online in person, to participate by submitting questions and comments too. Before we go into the meeting content, just a short note, I think we'll put up on the screen, about our commitment to academic excellence and not taking partisan positions in our work at Duke-Margolis. You can find out more about our policies at the links on the slide. I also want to note that I'm an independent member of the board of directors of Cigna & Johnson & Johnson and chair the executive committee of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. Next, I wanted to note that Duke-Margolis is convening this workshop under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The discussions today, while supported through a cooperative agreement with the FDA and intended to be frank and highly relevant to these topics, are not a federal advisory committee. In other words, we won't be voting, we won't be making specific recommendations or consensus, et cetera. This meeting will be a success if we have a strong, good discussion of all of these important and timely ideas. So next, I'd like to review the panel discussions and presentations teed up on the agenda. We're going to begin today, I think very appropriately, with a recorded keynote presentation from Principal Deputy of the FDA, Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA, Dr. Janet Woodcock. For the reasons I've already talked about, I can't think of a more fit for purpose opening speaker for this workshop than Janet. As you all know, she's with us in a pre-recording, since she is just finishing up a long, I'd say unique and truly impactful career at the agency. I know we all couldn't be more grateful for all of her public service, all that she's done over the last quarter century. And I personally am honored to have the opportunity to work closely with her, both in and out of government, as I know is the case for many of you there today. So with that framing, hopefully giving us some momentum, in the first session, we'll hear from current and retired regulators from the United States and Europe who have led the development of foundational guidance documents that have incorporated the principles of QBD and RBM, with additional perspectives from industry, trade group representatives on those guidance working groups. And then this is going to serve as the groundwork for a pivot to many QBD and RBM case studies. And there's often a sense that guidance documents are helpful, but it can maybe not provide enough practical insights as to what needs to be done in particular trials. Well, here we've got a lot of those actual case examples, and case study presentations will be complemented by an overview of recently aggregated cross-industry implementation data and robust discussion on where and how we are seeing gaps and how we can address those gaps in the adoption of QBD and RBM concepts. The QBD case studies will focus on how to integrate a holistic approach to study design, how to determine critical to quality factors, how critical to quality factor identification helps to achieve study objectives while facilitating risk monitoring and management, Then for that busy morning, we're going to take a break for lunch. We'll be hearing from a range of stakeholders on implementing a risk-based approach to sponsor oversight of clinical trials, including trial monitoring and additional activities performed by contracted service providers. This session will also feature case studies with attention to associated successes, remaining challenges, and advice for how to surmount those challenges. Case studies will cover both conventional and innovative clinical trials and incorporate insights on how advanced statistical tools, and more recently AI, can contribute to RBM advancements. We'll conclude with a panel discussion having reflections on what we've learned, what we've discussed today, and then immediate next steps for sponsors, CROs, and other stakeholders to make progress, accelerate progress on centering quality management in clinical studies. Our goal is to leave here today having identified numerous best practices and how they've been applied in diverse settings and practice, as well as any remaining outstanding needs that can facilitate further increased adoption of quality management now and into the future. Our co-conveners at the FDA are also interested in learning what they as regulators might be able to do to foster adoption of QBD and RBM in clinical trials and conduct. So we're looking for comments on that as well. Now, just one more slide with some meeting reminders before we get going today. We have a very large audience joining us today. Again, thank you for all the interest, both in person. I know many of you joining online. Early for those of you who are out west. I appreciate that too. We're glad to have you joining us to hear more about this critical topic. The audience members, as I've mentioned, you're encouraged to contribute to the meeting and submit questions. Try to take a picture of that Slido if you're in the audience. It's available on the website if you're joining us online. And if you'll also be able to ask questions if you're in the audience live at the microphone, as well as submitting those questions online. We're going to do our best to get to as many of these questions or comments as you have. We'll be making a note of all of them and incorporating them in the materials from this event. We'll ask our moderators to bring in some of the audience questions, comments, both live and virtual, into the panel discussions as time permits. We're going to re-up this information, this QR code using Slido to submit throughout each session. We want to make these discussions as engaging and responsive as possible to all of you in this really diverse and increasingly rich stakeholder community, focusing on these quality by design and RBM issues so that, again, we can make as much progress and get as many insights as possible. So thank you all for contributing the effort. And without further delay, it's my sincere pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Janet Woodcock, the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA.
Welcome. And on behalf of the FDA, thank you for attending this important public meeting entitled Building Quality into Clinical Studies Using Quality by Design and Risk-Based Monitoring Approaches. Proportionate and risk-based approaches to quality management are an integral part of modernization of the clinical research ecosystem, both to ensure participants' protection and reliability of study results, but on the same hand, efficiently developing safe and effective medical treatments and diagnostics. In fact, I must say, long ago, I was the person who introduced this concept of quality by design, bringing it over from the manufacturing area into clinical studies, because I really felt we had to be mindful about what we're trying to do, not simply apply rules, but really think about how we are designing and executing clinical studies to yield the best data to protect participants, but also not go overboard. Now, a foundation of the agency's focus on the quality of clinical research includes promotion of proportionate risk-based approaches that focus on the data and processes that are critical to participant safety and interpretable study results. So I think since that time, we've really been trying to focus on what do you really need to do. A milestone in the agency's work along these lines was a publication in 2013 of the Guidance, Oversight of Clinical Investigations, a Risk-Based Approach to Monitoring. This guidance highlighted the importance of oversight activities that are fit for purpose for each study by focusing on the study parameters critical to success of an individual study instead of using a one-size-fits-all approach. But of course, this has been somewhat hard in practice to implement because people have been used to doing monitoring in a different way. And in 2019, FDA and Duke Margolis held a meeting bringing FDA to international regulators, sponsors, CROs, and others from the research community to discuss how to improve the adoption and implementation of risk-based monitoring approaches based on the recommendations in the guidance, because it was clear that adoption was slowed or not a brisk uptake, partly because people are used to doing things in a certain way and they feared deviating from that. So why are we here today? Well, drug development costs have continued to increase, related both to complexity of clinical trials and significant failure rates, highlighting that we need to do better as we work to modernize the clinical trial enterprise. Because extra work that we do beyond what is necessary and fit for purpose simply increases cost, therefore decreasing the amount of study we can do and the amount of valuable data that we can learn, both in drug development, but also in clinical research writ large. Additionally, use of quality by design and risk-based monitoring approaches to plan and to conduct clinical investigations haven't been fully implemented among sponsors, as we'll hear about today from some of our speakers. And this isn't surprising given that it is a change, and conceptually, you really have to think about what you're doing and be confident that it'll be accepted not only by participants, investigators, and so forth, but actually by the regulators. Quality by design and risk-based monitoring approaches for managing risk in clinical studies can facilitate the modernization of the trials by increasing efficiency without compromising participant protections or the integrity of the trial results. But of course, we have to make sure we talk people into that and that they are confident that that statement is true. Today, as part of our efforts to encourage the modernization of clinical research, we'll highlight several significant new areas of focus that build on the work we've done in the past, including the 2019 meeting. First, we want to highlight the value of incorporating the patient voice into the planning of clinical trials, because patient perspectives can be a driver of both quality and success. And the more patient incorporation, input and incorporation have been implemented, the more we've learned about this. For example, we'll hear today from patients and patient advocates about study design features can significantly increase participant enrollment and retention in trials. This is an opportunity to encourage sponsors to partner with patient community in productive ways in the initial design. Second, this meeting adds the concept of building quality into clinical trials at the design phase. And this is really where a quality can be built into any kind of process, is how you design the process for quality. We're going to hear case study examples demonstrating the importance of designing quality into study protocols and all aspects of study planning, including the monitoring process. Third, this meeting highlights changes to clinical research that were incorporated during the COVID-19 pandemic, including lessons learned and best practices as we incorporate some of these changes into a post-pandemic world, including most notably incorporating decentralized clinical trial elements and centralized monitoring practices. And as terrible as the pandemic was, it certainly gave a big boost upward to these practices, and they became much more acceptable because necessity caused them to have to be used. And finally, we want to highlight the importance of harmonizing good clinical practice guidelines globally as part of our efforts to modernize clinical research. Clinical research is no longer a localized country activity. Much of it is international. In particular, we want to draw attention to the recently published draft version of ICH E6 R3, as well as ICH E8 R1, and hear from both regulators and industry about these important guidances. In both E6 and E8, you'll notice a focus on critical to quality factors, both risk-based approaches and fitness for purpose. Simply put, we want to encourage a focus on what matters most to make trials more efficient and user-friendly for everyone. So what do we hope to accomplish? Today, you'll hear from regulators, sponsors, clinical investigators, and patient advocates on the importance of quality throughout clinical trial development and conduct. We'll discuss the complexities of incorporating quality by design and risk-based monitoring approaches, including challenges and the lessons learned over the years. The good news is people have been trying to adopt these approaches, and we have learned a lot over the time. We will discuss how to leverage emerging technologies and innovative trial designs in trial planning and in risk management. Your voice is important as we navigate through this complex and evolving concept of quality management in clinical research. We need to have the community together and united in their understanding of these approaches. We all have a shared goal of protecting participants who enroll in the trials while ensuring the data collected is meaningful and high quality so that we can all rely upon those results. So thank you, and I hope this meeting is highly productive.
Go right ahead. All right, good morning. Oh, good, you can hear me, I can hear myself. It's always hard to follow Dr. Woodcock, but we'll do our best. I'm Jacqueline Corrigan-Cry. I'm the Principal Deputy Center Director in CEDAR. And I'm just really excited to be here. This is great. Thank you for joining us in person. And I know there's many of you online that we cannot see, and we look forward to hearing from you during the day as well. So this first session is really focused on regulatory perspectives on risk-based approaches to building quality into the design and conduct. And we're going to spotlight quality management principles in the design and conduct of clinical investigations, focusing on integrating quality by design and risk-based monitoring. They really go hand in hand. And we'll touch on recent FDA guidances as well as international guidances as well. Our presenters and panelists will discuss how regulators and clinical trial sponsors are applying these principles. So I'm going to go and introduce everyone before we start. So we're going to begin with presentations by Khair ElZarrad. He's the director of the Office of Medical Policy at FDA in the Center for Drugs. And then we'll be followed by Fergus Sweeney, who is joining us remotely. He is a retired clinical trials expert, but also formerly the EMA regulatory chair, I believe, to E6 and E8. After that, we're going to ask for opening remarks from our two industry colleagues, David Nickerson, who is the head of clinical quality management and global development operations for EMD Serono, and he was a pharma contributor for the ICH E6 R2 expert working group and is currently working on ICH E6 R3. And then Kerstin Koenig, who is the VP of Global Quality Assurance at GSK and has been the EFPIA topic lead for ICH E8 R1 renovation. So we have quite a brain trust on our panel and remotely. So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Khair to kick us off.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here today. I want to thank Duke Margolis and my FDA colleagues for organizing this meeting. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. As mentioned, I'm Khair ElZarrad. I'm the director for the Office of Medical Policy, and part of our objectives, actually, our primary objectives and goals over the next few years is really to modernize clinical trials. Although I'm talking about my office, but it's really a collaborative effort across the FDA in general. We see this as a primary aspect of what we would like to move forward with and modernize across the board. So for today, there is a lot here to address, but I'm hoping today we'll go over a little bit modernizing the clinical trial enterprise and why that's an essential thing. I think all of us would share that perspective, but I want to provide a little bit of a challenge. I think this is something we feel internally, but I know the community at large also feels. And then I want to go into a little bit into our guidances, the risk-based monitoring guidances, and then ICH E6 specifically. I'll be mentioning E8 because you cannot divorce design and conduct. I know Fergus will be discussing E8 a little bit in more details. And then end with a little bit of a general thoughts on conclusions across the board here. So as many of you are aware, like this slide is old, but I think it behooves us to remember that we made progress, but not enough progress. This is just to show the timeline of development for a drug, all the way from having a compound to something approved by the FDA. It still takes us years. It might not be 9-10 years, but still takes us years. And I think it behooves us to figure out how to get the drugs, promising drugs earlier to patients who need them. This is another actually old figure that is from ASPE. It highlights the cost of development per therapeutic areas, and this is just for clinical development. As you can see, this is in the tens of millions of dollars. In some therapeutic areas, this can get even to the $100 million. So we really need to shift gears and make progress in the efficiency aspect. And just to highlight that there are quite a bit of thoughts here around how to move forward, how to really even be better to participants in the clinical trials to make sure we retain participants in a clinical trial, recruit and retain. So we have a challenge here. We still have a challenge. We made progress, but we really need to address the complexity, the cost, the lagging aspect of innovations in clinical trials. I'll be amiss not to mention COVID, obviously. I think COVID provided us with examples where a lot of clinical trials did not provide promising results, did not provide actionable results. So this sounds like a little bit of doom and gloom, so it behooves me to say that there is a lot of positives as well. We've seen clinical trials that took advantage of the healthcare infrastructure, clinical trials that utilized appropriately decentralized elements, pragmatic elements. And I think we're seeing that moving forward into, and advancing and normalizing such designs. So there is positives as well. So as we think of clinical trials, we really we have to think of the spectrum of stakeholders and the areas that are actually developing at the same time, all the way from advancing evidence generation paradigms and the health data that's constantly generated and potentially could augment or enhance even clinical trials, to the increasing digital data availability across the board. And we're no longer talking about standard sensors in watches and rings. I think this is becoming far more advanced than we anticipated even 5 years ago. Think of passive sensing, think of data being collected and generated and analyzed in a very, very rapid format across the board. Add to that the innovation in clinical trial designs. We used to think of decentralization as somewhat novel. I think we're seeing it more normalized. Leonard Sachs in my office loved to say, decentralization is not new. 20 years ago, we had clinical trials utilizing phones, for example. So understanding really how to put those aspects into action altogether. So what you'll hear from me today overall is that we're really pushing and promoting for efficiency and flexibility in clinical trials and to facilitate innovations. We want regulations to enhance the appropriate tools that can be utilized for the benefit of patients to make clinical trials more efficient. We want to implement proportionate and risk-based approaches across the board, and you will see that across all of our guidances. And then a cornerstone to all of this is the concept that all of us discussed, the fitness for purpose, as you heard from Dr. Woodcock, quality by design, risk-based quality management. And I'm going to discuss the terminology a little bit more and what they mean in the larger context of things. So FDA efforts to support quality by design and risk-based monitoring are really part of the focus for today. This included quite a bit of outreach because we really want to understand how the community are implementing the risk-based monitoring, implementing quality by design, and what metrics can be gleaned into what are the barriers to such applications. As you all know, we started in 2013 by our first guidance on risk-based approach, and then in 2023, we elaborated further. Those two guidances are very much linked. We elaborated further with a Q&A guidance, latest guidance in that area, providing a little bit more clarity and details. And then E8 and E6, again, marrying the design and conduct, and I'm focusing today a little bit more on E6, but in totality, we're hoping this group of guidances and our future activities will push for quality by design and risk-based monitoring to be the norm, if you would. These are the two guidances that I mentioned, the 2013 and the 2023, and the links to them. So both guidances really highlight some basic factors that I think all of us share and understand, the risk assessment that's needed, the development of a study-specific monitoring plan, and I think the study-specific is very important here, as not just taking a global thing that's you have to have a monitoring plan for everything, and everything should be structured the same way. The context of the study is really important. Having a dynamic approach for continual improvement is a critical aspect, as well as encouraging centralized monitoring where acknowledging the electronic systems can be beneficial in that context. Now, in 2023, we provided a little bit more anecdotes and specifics. For example, for risk assessment, we discussed a little bit more of the documentation methods, the conclusion, and the implementation. For the monitoring approach, we asked specifically for a tailored monitoring approach. Again, the context should really guide us, not just that you have a list of things that we need to check. We really need to understand the context of the trial itself. The monitoring plan content is also discussed. And this is really important because we get questions sometimes like you expect the monitoring plan to be the same across trials or the same level of details. Trials can be simple, can be more complex, and the monitoring plan should reflect that as well and reflect the risks that are involved in the trial. Also, we discussed quite a bit on how to communicate monitoring results. You want data and information to reach people who will have to do action to really behave and react to those results. From there, I want to move to the ICH guidelines, and I hope you see that progression, that for the specific on risk-based monitoring quality by design into more normalizing those concepts as part of design and conduct in general, and I think E8 and E6 illustrate that really well for us. So for E8, and I know Fergus will discuss that more, it highlights the key concept of fitness for purpose. It actually described quality as fitness for purpose. And I think that's really a critical aspect to think about because it brings the context of the trial. What's fit for purpose for that trial? And then it emphasizes designing quality into the clinical trial itself. It focuses on the identification and review of the critical to quality factors, has a very nice discussion of that. And also brings risk proportionality approach to quality management in general. So it really sets the foundation for thinking of quality as part of the design. E6 and E8, again, as I mentioned, are very much tied. That was highlighted in the concept paper, linking the design to conduct for ICH. Historically, as you know, E6 was published in 1996, updated since then, and then the latest iteration was made public last year in 2023. We've received thousands of comments on that version. And we were excited to see the interest, the level of interest. A lot of it was really positive, saying like, okay, we're modernizing, but a lot of it asking us to do more. So the working group, and Dave is on the group here, we are daily working. We just actually started at 6 a.m. today with a meeting, global meeting, to start addressing some of those comments. So the working group really takes it very seriously that E6 is the only harmonized guideline globally, and its importance cannot be understated. So we need to get it right, and we take that very seriously. So what we did initially is we did a literature review of all the available data, if you would, on E6 and how the community are applying it. This is just examples of the literature review that we looked at. We also utilized CTTI, Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative. They did a survey and targeted interviews that were very helpful to us. Also, we did some engagement and public meetings as well, and I'm going to discuss those. So the initial takeaway from the comments before we started is that E6 has been applied widely across all designs, including at times observational studies, not clinical trials. Obviously, when we're thinking of observational study, that's, in our view, is a different ecosystem, right? You're not necessarily having an intervention in that setting. So the whole risk profile is different. So that's something we were worried about when we started. Also, the idea that funders sometimes apply E6 as a one-size-fits-all. Here's E6, make sure you check the marks across the board and move forward. That's exactly what we don't want to do. We want the context of the trial to be considered. And then there were concerns also about meeting GCB requirements, especially in public health crisis, public health issues, and obviously the goal is not just to check that mark, is to understand the context of the trial and conduct the trial appropriately. So in E6, we started with the goal of to have a guideline that will highlight two main pillars, the protection of participants and ensuring the reliability of results. Those were really the two guiding principles across the board of the guideline. We want the design and conduct of the trial to be proportionate to the risks and the importance of the data being collected. And we want trial design and conduct to minimize the unnecessary complexity in the trial. Basics, but I think the details hopefully would reflect that. So we did multiple engagement with academic stakeholders, because academic stakeholders are really important parts, especially in the last 5 years, as all of us learned. Academia can be a big part of clinical trial ecosystem. And we also try to enhance the transparency of publishing our guidelines and principles early. Even when they're still in development, we want to communicate with the public, here's where we are, and get some input on that. So what's new? For E6, you'll see a new structure where you have principles that we believe they should withstand the test of time, and annexes. Annexes are a little bit more details. And the idea here are the principles, hopefully, they will, 10 years from now, they'll still be relevant. The details in the annexes can evolve. You will see the scope much more focused. So no longer, hopefully, confusion that this is designed for observational study. It's not. It's interventional clinical trials. And across the board, you will see language that will facilitate design, such as decentralized design, point-of-care trials, and we want digital health technology to be utilized appropriately. So across the board, you will see that. So across the board, you will see a practical and feasible expectations around the conduct of clinical trials. I'm not going to go into the details, but hopefully you will see, one key element that one of our academic stakeholders always told us, the key idea here is to think. It can be really, the whole thing can be summed as think, have a thoughtful approach. We encourage fitness for purpose. We incorporate learning from innovative trial designs into the work. We highlighted that participant safety and result reliability are the two pillars here. We encourage registration and result reporting, and also improvement to informed consent. And those are minor details, but I thought it's really important to bring the patient to the perspective. For informed consent, for example, we have a long way to go still. So we're trying to really push for that. So going to my last few slides on what's next, we started the work on Annex 2 of E6. Annex 2 it's going to address trials that will utilize decentralized element, point-of-care trials, as well as certain uses of real-world data in the context of interventional clinical trials. So it will be a high-level guideline. It will not be a guideline specifically in decentralization, for example, but hopefully will touch on the key elements that may be confusing and will provide some clarity. And finally, I would leave you with that it will take a village, really, to move us forward. None of this is going to be E6 and E8 going to be a miracle to advance the field. We need to work together and globally, as Dr. Woodcock mentioned, clinical trial enterprise is no longer a one-country issue. We want to collaborate on implementation and capacity building, and hopefully that's something you will see from us as an agency. We're shifting into how do we support appropriate implementation and accurate interpretation of our policies in those areas. We want to develop responsive and accessible training. We think training is really important. As we developed E6, we always identified areas. We really need to elaborate a little bit more this on training. So hopefully you will see more use case training. It's not just recitation of what we developed already. And we want to avoid the all or nothing approach. You will see that over and over again. We believe trials can be hybrid, can utilize different elements. We should not seek, design and flashiness just because of that. We should really understand the trial and what makes it more efficient. So in conclusion, hopefully you will see today and throughout our work that we are committed to supporting the modernization of clinical trials, QBD and risk-based quality monitoring, that it's going to be across the board, across all our guidelines. I don't like to stick to specific terminology here, but take it from E6 and E8. Quality is embedded across the design and the conduct of the trial, and proportionate and risk-based monitoring is across the board, not just for one element in the trial. And hopefully E6 is intended to support those innovations. We still have a long way to go, but we're committed to going it with you all. Finally, if you have any questions, here's our email address. Please feel free to email us. I hope I did not take too much time, and I will go to the next speaker, I believe.
Thank you, Khair. And now we'd like to turn the mic over to Fergus Sweeney, who's joining us from Europe. Yes, he's on. Great.
So, thank you very much, and thank you to Duke Margolis and the FDA for the invitation to speak here and the opportunity to be with you and to continue to be part of this discussion. Next slide. I have been involved for many years in this discussion, but I did retire 18 months ago, so I have to be clear that any views I express are my own. I don't represent any organization or institution, but I equally have no conflicts of interest, and I'm retired. Next slide. So really, I think one of the key underlying messages that I want to convey, and I'll bring it back in different contexts, is see the bigger picture. People can get down into the weeds and the detail of particular clinical trials, particular processes, particular aspects of monitoring, for example. And really, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. And I think one of the key things we discussed when we were developing E8, which is general considerations for clinical studies. It's called E8, but we said, well, maybe it should be E1 or E0. It wasn't possible to change that, but remember, it's a family of guidelines, and E8 is really there as a foundation, giving an overview, and with its extensive rewrite linked to what is now being done in E6, it really is important for everybody to read and understand, because it sets the philosophy, it sets the mindset. And in many ways, it's about empowering people. I mean, Khair said, one of our academic contributors often brings it down to think. And it is about thinking, and it's about empowering people to think. Researchers, protocol designers, patients, and many others. It's giving a role to really contribute to and make designs better. So please do look at that. You've got E6 there, and you can see the other guidances, but put them all into their context. I think it takes about an hour to read E8, probably an hour and a half to read E6. So it's not a huge commitment. People often dive into one paragraph and then go from there, but you need to see the bigger picture and the philosophy. Next slide, please. So this is similar to a slide Khair has shown, and again, it puts E8, talking about the fundamental trial design principles, but also the quality, risk-based approaches, critical to quality factors, and then E6 is about implementation and takes those ideas and philosophies and brings them to a more implementation level. But read the two together. Don't just jump to E6. Read E8 first to put in context. Next slide. So this is a broad overview of E8, general considerations on clinical studies, and you have the basic general principles, which are to protect the trial participants and their health and welfare, to take a scientific approach to design, conduct, and analysis, and the definitions of quality and quality by design derived from this. And thirdly, and this really was a new step in the revised version of E8, to engage with patients to get their input throughout. And that's critical and really, really important and very enriching. Quality by design and descriptions of critical to quality factors, drug development planning. It's a continuous process. We build knowledge. Design, conduct, and reporting. Examples of critical to quality factors to help thinking about them, and an annex of study site. So well worth reading to get the big picture and understand before you delve further. And whether you're new to clinical trials or you've been in clinical trials for 20 years, it's a change in mindset. So please do read. Next slide. And this is the kind of thing, and some of these slides quote the wording from the guidelines, just to show you how rich it is, and to emphasize, so apologies if they're a bit busy. But here, this is from the general considerations, and as has been said, quality of a clinical study is fit for purpose. But then we have to remember, what is the purpose of a clinical study? So we do a clinical study to generate reliable information, to answer research questions. And of course, we have to make sure they are good research questions, but to answer research questions and support decision-making whilst protecting study participants. And therefore, the quality of the information generated, so the results of the trial, should be sufficient to support good decision-making. And that may be decision-making by regulators, decision-making by a sponsor to carry on with or cease the development of a product or a particular research line. But ultimately, it's the decision of a patient to take this medicine, of a healthcare provider to prescribe this medicine. And all of these things we're doing is to support that ultimate use by patients and help them to be sure they can make a good decision. Quality by design ensures that the quality of a study is driven proactively by designing quality into the study protocol and processes using prospective multidisciplinary approach, proportionate to the risks involved, and communicating clearly on how this will be achieved, because it's not one size fits all, so it will be different from trial to trial, and clear communication is essential. Next slide. I've emphasized the importance of patient input into study design. And I think just to pick up on a couple of things on obviously the overall concept, but the patients, the third bullet, involving patients at the early stage of study design is likely to increase trust, facilitate recruitment, promote adherence, and should continue throughout the study. And the last bullet, ultimately, the patient's input and their experience supports development of medicines that are better tailored to patients' needs. And it really is enriching to have those discussions and well worth the investment. Next slide. Involving stakeholders has really been a twofold approach with ICH during this GCP renovation with E8 first and then E6. So we've engaged globally with stakeholders. It was a big workshop during the drafting of E8 in Washington in 2019. Through E6, ICH adopted a stakeholder engagement plan, and particularly this is engagement with researchers, academia and healthcare professionals, and with patients. There have been regional workshops and regional representatives from around the world contributing to the drafting of E6. And that's on the development of the guidance, but then built into each study should be the engagement with patients and with researchers, investigators, and others in making good designs and protocols that can work and answer good questions correctly. It's very informative, very enriching, and it leads to better guidance and better trial designs, and with much more buy-in of stakeholders to the process and to the results. Last week was at a workshop in EMA in Europe where multi-stakeholder platform discussing clinical trial data analytics. So you think quite specialized, but there were patients there were academic researchers, there were people from industry, regulators, and some other specialties. And really, it's a much richer discussion. People are very constructive, and you come out with a much richer outcome than if one group of experts had discussed that alone. So really encourage these approaches. Next slide, please. So the critical to quality factors, another important concept brought forward in ICH-E8, and it's a basic set of factors relevant to ensuring study quality should be identified. And you need to do this upfront, and these are factors that stand out as critical to study quality. And they're critical because if their integrity was undermined, the reliability or the ethics of the decision-making based on those studies would be undermined. You need to determine the risks that threaten their integrity and the probability and impact of those risks and decide whether they can be accepted or should be mitigated. Not every risk can be mitigated, and trying to address every single risk, large and small, will just absorb far too much resource. Perfection in every aspect is rarely achievable or only achieved by use of resources out of proportion to the benefit. So study procedures really need to be proportionate to the risks inherent in the study, including to participants, and the importance of the information collected. Next slide, please. And here we have approaches to identifying the critical to quality factors, and this really frames the whole mindset of engaging with stakeholders, but also approaching the design of studies. And these four elements are based on far wider principles of research governance, which are adopted much more widely than in pharmaceuticals or healthcare. So these have not just been written specially for E8, although they're tailored to it. They are very widely held and widely supported approaches, and fundamentally establish a culture that supports open dialogue. People can be shy to criticize a protocol because it's been signed off or it's been written by a certain expert. No one person or group can really know what's best. So you really need to reward critical thinking, people who say, why? Do we really need to do this? Do we need this in this study? Not copy paste from one study to the next and accumulate. focus on activities essential to the study and really think about what non-essential activities can be eliminated. Engage stakeholders, patients, treating physicians, study nurses, other people involved. Get them in because they will help you learn how to design a study, how to design good study procedures, and therefore increase your success. And of course, review. What you think before the study starts may change with experience. So have continuous review and adapt as needed. Next slide, please. So quality is a primary consideration in design, planning, conduct, and analysis, and a necessary component. And the likelihood that a clinical study will answer the research questions, preventing important errors, can be dramatically improved through attention to design. Monitoring, audit are in many ways, in part, a retrospective activity. They're important in the quality assurance process, but sadly, we all know an unfortunate amount of monitoring time can be involved in trying to pick up the pieces because a protocol has been poorly designed or a data capture instrument or things have been poorly communicated. So design will really enable the process far more. Next slide. You need to look at the critical quality factors, identify the risks, and then ensure that the necessary control procedures are put in place and communicated. Next slide. And again, in E8, these are the different sections of E8, so section 7 and that, and now overlooking the different sections. This gives you an insight into where to find the discussion and examples of quality factors. So really, again, an encouragement to read the documents holistically because they inform your thinking then on your approach. Next slide. So these then are carried forward into the implementation, into the good clinical practice. And I've just picked a couple of points from the principles that, again, carry through these risk-based approaches. So processes and measures approaches should be implemented in a way proportionate to the risk to the participants and importance of data collected. The focus should be on the risk to participants beyond those associated with standard medical care. So the things that are brought into their lives by the study protocol and its procedures, medicine, etc. And we need to prospectively manage those, but keep on reviewing. Next slide, please. We should drive in a scientific way. So we need a clear, concise, and operationally feasible protocol, and that's fundamental to studies. The scientific objectives should be clear, and all the other processes and documents and procedures should be clear, concise, and operationally feasible. I think that's a really important message because things have got very complicated in many areas, and investigator sites, monitors, and organizations can't cope and can't then do another study or another 2 studies because they've absorbed their resource in one. So it's better to be concise, streamlined, do it efficiently, answer the question, and move on. Then you can answer more questions and better questions. Next slide, please. And they should generate reliable results. And it reiterates that the quality and amount of the information generated in a trial should be sufficient to provide confidence in the results and support good decision-making. So again, bringing back to the purpose of clinical trial results, which is to support good decision-making, should be fit for purpose, proportionate to the risk to participants and importance of the data required, operationally feasible, and avoid unnecessary complexity. So computerized systems, we'll come to digitization, should be fit for purpose as well. Next slide, please. So really all of these philosophies, it's important to bring those forward into your research. Now, the next few slides I just take as illustrations of some things that can be brought forward and really supported by this. So these aren't quotes from anywhere, they're just my own thoughts. But digitalization, I think it's really important we establish trust in the process of digitalization, but enable research as well. We could make this too complicated for people to do. So we have to really get a good balance. It's about data provenance and validity, technical and scientific, being able to trust the data and rely on it. Using new data sources, as Khair has described a number of them. Personal data protections of the trial participants, of the patients, is an enabler of clinical research. Patients have a legal right to ensure that their privacy is protected, and we need to do that. But they also have a legitimate expectation that they have access to involvement in research and to its benefits, and that their data is well used so research can answer important questions. And we need to address both of these things together so we get a good outcome. It's a complex landscape. We need to manage it, but we should not make it complicated. We need to use the opportunities for the possibility to support the possibility of better trials, better research, and better healthcare. And remember, the use of digital tools is progressing, perhaps even faster now in healthcare than in clinical trials. So we need to keep pace with that in our clinical trial world. Next slide, please. Enabling decentralized trials. Again, the right trial for the right purpose. So decentralized trials or partly decentralized trials can be good for one medicine, one type of illness, one type of study design, but may not be good for another. So you have to think about, first, what is the research question you're trying to answer, the right research question, and can decentralized approaches address some of it, all of it, or none of it, and make your decision and then use the tools that are appropriate for the study you're trying to design and the participant populations that you're addressing. Sometime, and Khair said, I worked in clinical trials in the 80s. We already had decentralized approaches. We had wearables, 24-hour blood pressure monitoring. So it's not that novel, really. And healthcare used to be more decentralized. The doctor came to our house often, not us always going to the doctor. So we've kind of gone backwards and now going forwards again in terms of that localization and bringing things to the patient. But remember, the sponsor and investigator have clear legal roles and responsibilities, and despite how these are organized, those still apply. We need to take care that the investigator role is clear and the medical care of the trial participant in the context of the trial is clearly controlled and delivered by the investigator. And we need to respect the autonomy of the trial participants. But we've seen with the pandemic, as others have mentioned, is a clear use case, and we can do these things. Next slide. And then on enabling centralized monitoring, and indeed monitoring in general, I think these are words now quoted from under the E6 3114 or from the draft, which is public, about the aim of monitoring. So it's to ensure participants' rights, safety, and well-being, and the reliability of results. And it's one of the principal quality control activities, but it involves a broad range of activities, and they're described there. And I think we have to remember that people get lost in monitoring is source data verification or source data review, and it's a whole range of things, and we need to make sure that all of those are addressed. And of course, those can be addressed in different ways, just as we are, I think, 3,000 people now on this webinar. If we'd all gone, or if there'd been an attempt to have only a face-to-face meeting in Washington, we might have had 200 people. So you can really achieve a lot more with different approaches, provided they work for the particular context and research question. But think about the bigger picture of monitoring and what you're trying to achieve. And the next slide. And the sponsor can then describe that in a monitoring plan. And for centralized monitoring, in the old GCP E6 originally, it was in exceptional circumstances, but now that's not the case. It's not closed in that way. So it can provide additional monitoring capabilities that can complement and reduce the extent or frequency of on-site monitoring or be used on its own. And I think there's a lot of richness here, and I'd really encourage all of those in industry and academia who are using these approaches to be really transparent and public about how you do it, how it works, and really build confidence in this process, because it's actually, you can achieve a lot more in many respects by doing this and spotting problems with protocol interpretation or implementation than you would necessarily if your head is down in individual data points all the time. So you're stepping back, and again, it's looking at the bigger picture and using tools that enable that, which weren't there 5 or 10 years ago, we have to admit. It's really, we've crossed a threshold now in our ability to do this technically. Next slide, please. Now, this is a slide, and again, it shows we had a long journey. Dr. Woodcock referred to the CTTI and publication by the FDA in 2012-2013 of the risk-based monitoring approach. From Europe, we had at same time a guidance on quality-based risk management, risk-based quality management in clinical trials. And it's really been evolving discussion. It's been quite a journey. I used this slide at that time in 2012-2013, but I think it's still valid. And really what it's saying, it says in E8 that drug development planning builds on knowledge acquired. And if you look at the three bands in the slide, in the first one, we see that uncertainty decreases as the knowledge of product increases. Again, as you go through development, trials tend to get larger and the weight of individual participant data decreases as the number of participants increases. So you've different approaches, and that can influence how you do the monitoring. Now, I do emphasize, don't read anything into where these lines cross over. This is a sketch. I drew it. It's not based on specific data, but experience. But you really need to think about it. This is not one size fits all. There are different approaches that will apply depending on, are you in first in human or are you in a large post-authorization trial? You may never get to large trials as such if you're in rare diseases. So individual data may always have a huge influence on the whole outcome of the protocol. So you need to be careful. Next slide. And that's just emphasizing this is actual situation will vary case by case. I had a lot of questions about, oh, you've got the crossover just below where phase 3 starts or ends. That wasn't my intent. It's to show a trend. Next slide, please. And this is finally, a slide to emphasize in Europe now, there is an initiative called Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU. It was kicked off early last year. It's a joint initiative of the heads of medicines agencies of the member states, the European Commission and the European Medicines Agency to transform EU clinical research environment. And is to support the conduct, or a number of its objectives include supporting the conduct of large multinational trials, or sufficiently powered, I would say. Some of them may not be large if they're in rare diseases, or not large as such, but you need to have properly powered trials to support SMEs, academia, and others, address unmet medical needs, but allow also large randomized trials, platform trials, point-of-care trials, in a sense, a decentralized approach, facilitate coordinated scientific advice, ensure a unified approach, and engage all stakeholders in the process in inclusive patient-oriented medicines development and delivery. And that multi-stakeholder platform was established in 23. So and the meeting I was at last week was part of this, do Google the ACT-EU and follow their activities. So next slide. And this is my last slide. So everyone involved in the conduct of clinical trials should read and understand these guidelines. Read them both. It takes about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, depending on how quick you are. Really understand the mindset and the change in mindset. This changes the way we all work. Don't just look at individual bullet points and add more to the status quo, but really fundamentally review how you're approaching things. Change management is the greatest challenge. Adjusting all our behaviors, our attitudes, move away from our preconceived ideas and interests and onto a better, newer way of working. This is why engaging all of the stakeholders, patients and researchers, and others is important, because that helps you to shift your mindset, and it also gives us all the courage to be pragmatic. And I think that's really important. The greatest achievements will be by those who embrace new approaches and seek to make them work. There is no regulatory impediment per se. And just 2 last quotes from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry: perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And then from Albert Einstein, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So put those 2 together and you really have, I think, a good description of where we're going. Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Fergus and Khair. Very rich presentations and lots to digest. So as regulators, we're very good about making recommendations, and then we turn it over to industry to sort of do the hard work of putting it together. And so I'd like to sort of turn it over to first David to give us your thoughts as you listen to these presentations.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So over the years, I've had the extremely fortunate opportunity to have a seat at the table during many of the discussions that have led to the evolution and the further elaboration of this concept of quality by design. It really began with, interestingly, a project that the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative started in the late 2000s, related to not quality by design at all, but related to monitoring, relating to how can we best improve the quality of our clinical trials through monitoring. And it's very, very interesting to see how the concept has evolved over the years, where we've changed our mindset, to coin the phrase that Fergus used. We're no longer focusing on how can we build quality into our clinical trials through audits or through monitoring. We're focused now on how can we build quality into our clinical trial protocols, how can we build quality and reliability into our operational processes that we deploy from an industry point of view to conduct these clinical trials. So as hard as we are on ourselves, and as much as we would like to strive to achieve perfection with regards to this approach, I think it's worth acknowledging how far we've come since that time frame. Now, from an industry point of view, we love complexity. We create complexity every day. It's what we live on. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about quality by design, it's not really about process. Sure, there's a process we put in place. We need SOPs. We need our control documents in order to govern how we approach these activities. But at the end of the day, it's about this. It's about thinking. As Fergus mentioned, one of our compatriots in this endeavor, Martin Landy, loves to use the phrase, just think. And at the end of the day, that's really what this is all about. Being thoughtful, proactively engaging with the various stakeholders who are involved in our clinical trials to ensure that we're designing protocols that meet the specific need that we're trying to achieve, but also adapting our operational approaches in order to better deliver those factors that are critical to quality in the context of patient safety and data reliability. So I'll wrap up there and I think turn it over to Kerstin.
Great. Kerstin?
Thank you. We're already using a lot of my thoughts because Dave and I are quite similar in our approach, and we have a long journey both in quality management, but I started actually my career more in auditing, and it's a hard way for you to learn that you cannot audit quality into anything if you're actually responsible for the auditing team. I have the same long journey also with quality by design because I was also starting to work with a CTTI project, actually quality by design adoption, because we had great tool out there and we were really questioning ourselves with all the support we had from the regulators. Why is industry and academic and everybody else not using what is already out there? And I was quite happy when I was appointed to be the EPIA topic lead for E8, mainly working on chapter 3 and chapter 7, which is quality by design. And I promise you, we're still working on additional training material. And we're possibly going to be able to release that in the next months. Because it's changing, it's putting QBD in the forefront from a regulatory perspective. And there was absolutely alignment from industry and regulators that we wanted to have that in this guideline. We had a little bit of a discussion that we wanted to use QBD as a wording because it was more used on the manufacturing side. How are we going to explain the concepts to the clinical environment? But I think we did a good job with defining that. But I think it's also important to go back to that it is a behavior change. So like Fergus said with change management, we need to do things differently. And we should not add something to the status quo. Because as Dave said, we from an industry perspective, we tend to make things very complex, but actually it should make things simpler. And in my personal opinion, and I know we hear examples later on, you also have to put the concept of QPD in a broader perspective, how we can actually change and innovate the way we do drug development. So how can we really build in quality from in the forefront and reduce rework which goes over the quality by design aspect just in protocol design and all of that. And if we all work together, and I think there's great, the community here and what I've seen in the past and what I see in the future, I think we're all aligned in that concept. We just have to get things going now, because as I said, E8 is out since quite a while already.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move into our moderated discussion and audience Q&A. For those who are online, you can use the QR code or visit slido.com. Enter QBD for online submissions of questions. As our audience are getting the questions, we're going to start with a couple of questions. I'm going to start, we talked a little bit, and I think all of you mentioned, COVID-19 sort of forced fast change, and of course then, that was a crisis, and we sometimes then come back, and we're also seeing other things. We're seeing emerging technologies like AI, and of course the recent regulatory guidances. So how have all these, and where do you see these technologies moving to advance, quality by design and risk-based monitoring? I'll just open it up.
I can go ahead. I actually was surprised that we, in my opinion, went a little bit backwards after the pandemic. I was expecting that all what we had learned from lessons learned, we're going to continue. It seems to be the pandemic was an enabler, and we were actually putting a lot of more decentralized clinical trial elements into one trial than we did before. Like Fergus and Khair was mentioning, it was out there in individual elements before. Now we tend to put certain elements, but not what we could do overall. And I think there's a lot of engagement from the regulators, or encouragement from the regulators, actually try, we're going to support you, ask us for guidance. Not sure if I'm really using that. I'm not sure it's because we don't have a centralized department who is helping with that, or we as a sponsor are not very we don't have the risk appetite. Dave possibly can something add, but I'm a little bit disappointed. I was hoping for a little bit more.
I would just add quickly that I think COVID was positive in the sense, if there was a positive sense, that it created a burning platform for us from an industry point of view, where we were really forced to change the way we were approaching clinical trials, the way we were conducting clinical trials, in order simply to maintain that continuity. Agree, Kerstin, that I think since the remission of the pandemic, there's been a degree of backpedaling. Some of that, I think, is probably associated with trial and error. I think the general direction of the curve is still pointing upwards towards the adoption of continued adoption of different, perhaps more decentralized approaches to clinical trial conduct and clinical trial oversight. But generally speaking, I think, as you said, we are a relatively risk-averse industry. The more our industry efforts can be supported either through the adoption of new guidelines encouraging those approaches, the more I think we'll see those methodologies being implemented. However, if we do see that there are, say, inspection findings which tend to dial back on our willingness to implement those approaches, I think there'll be a negative reaction there.
Thank you.
Just like a couple of quick thoughts. We were definitely thinking of the public health emergency and COVID in general in the development of Annex 2 of E6, about decentralization, the use of real-world data and point of care. And a lot of the language we added and we were thinking about including is about actually normalizing certain appropriate processes, remote processes. A lot of us, maybe in Europe and the Americas, are kind of more accepting of those modalities, but this is not necessarily a shared global perspectives. So we need to really bring everybody on board. So COVID definitely served as a catalyst in that arena as well.
Thank you. Fergus, anything to add?
No, I think we need to recognize that individually, things like with decentralized trials, they were happening 10 or 15 years ago. So our sudden fright when we see a clinical trial that uses a lot more of them, we should be not frightened and more accepting. And I think what's happened, which is really important, is that COVID came at a time when the world was, in any case, digitizing very rapidly. So our ability to cope with the pandemic was much, much higher at the time it happened than had it occurred 6 years or 12 years earlier. And we would have gone through that digitization without the pandemic, but perhaps not seeing the beneficial use cases in the same ways. But we need to understand that these are not just for use in a pandemic. You can apply them in wider healthcare. And the healthcare system is doing that. People are using telemedicine more and more. So and society is more accepting of it, and it enables people who are further away from the doctor to benefit.
Great, thank you. So we do have an audience question about how can quality assurance professionals really drive, and it says FDA's modernization, but I think more generally, modernization of quality into operations of risk-based quality management. Any thoughts on that?
I think we have to evaluate our own role as a quality assurance professional. We have to change the way we think and how we see ourselves. We have to move to being a process accelerator and enabler. We're not the police, as we can neither monitor nor audit nor inspect quality. And we have great experts actually later on who will possibly provide more insight in that, on what we can do with quality narratives, being more active, also in how we work together with the regulators, bringing proactive quality approaches in submission dossiers, show what we have done from a quality by design perspective, use risk methodologies on focusing on the risk and not the issue. But it's for everybody, not only for the quality assurance professionals, really to change the behavior and mindset. So focusing on building in quality at the forefront, not, as I said, auditing it from the end.
So Kerstin is best positioned to speak as a quality assurance professional. My particular role is in a quality management function, which is also a quality function, but which is embedded into the development operations or clinical operations business. And it's actually my team's reason for being, largely, is to become experts in the concept of quality by design and the actual facilitation of the process around identifying with the clinical trial protocol what is critical to quality and ensuring that the teams, the cross-functional study teams, are really being proactive and thoughtful about identifying the risks that could potentially have a negative impact on our ability to deliver those critical to quality factors. Sam and I were discussing this prior to the meeting today. It's a very unique skill set that is needed in order to be able to embed an individual into a team and to actually facilitate that cross-functional conversation. I very much would encourage folks to consider that approach for the future.
And that leads to another question we have from the audience, which is, we talk a lot about you need to identify those critical to quality factors to design and then monitor, but, are there tools for those who may not be that experienced or are trying to think through this? Are there tools that we should recommend that they look at?
So one thing, maybe it's a little bit a higher level, in the training programs that we're planning, we're definitely trying to target the process as much as we can and also address use cases, realistic use cases. We're hoping that will at least lend itself to the initial thinking process here. I think another thing that would really help us, if understanding the true barriers and true enablers as well. Across the board, like from a regulatory perspective, we hear of barriers, but understanding what are really the cause of those barriers, the reasons behind them, are they perceptions versus actual barriers, that will help us move forward as well in general.
Great. I have a question from our audience online. How do you think the revised guidelines will support rare disease trials? And what are the key considerations for clinical researchers for rare disease trials, which actually, raise other challenges? Any thoughts on that?
Start out. I guess I would say that I think quality by design as a concept is even more critical in consideration of rare disease studies, ensuring that we are proactively understanding patients or potential trial participants' perspectives regarding their wants and their needs with respect to clinical trial design and operational approaches for those trials become really essential in order to facilitate the successful conduct of what is often a very difficult trial to conduct.
And maybe I can add, like part of why we're interested in decentralization, for example, the use of DHTs, is really to enable easier way to be part of the trial in general. We keep hearing, for example, travel even is such a hindrance to participants to participate in the trial. And when we talk about rare diseases, that's a major issue. So the more we enable efficiencies in the clinical trials in general, I think that the more we really cater to our rare disease community at large.
Fergus, I know you're over there, so sometimes we just want to give you an opportunity to respond to.
Well, I just perhaps make a general reflection. It also comes back to the question on quality professionals as well as on the rare diseases. Coming back to this stakeholder consultation, involve a multidisciplinary group in the room. If you just look to auditors or inspectors or regulatory assessors or the cardiovascular expert in the company or whatever, if you put those individually into a room, they'll just talk themselves into an ever more complex and extreme version of an opinion. You need to have the different perspectives in the room to bring it to the middle to what's actually achievable. And I think we need to be careful as regulators, as experts, that views expressed affect the way people behave, and so you have to be careful what you say and how it's applied and how you're giving the context always, but always having, I think, a multi-stakeholder group and enabling them, empowering them to criticize and think differently, I think is really important.
Thank you. I also want to say to our audience, we do have 2 mics, so please feel free if a question occurs to you to just come up to the mic. We have another question from our online audience, and it's a bit specific, so I'm going to go a little bit more high level on this. They note that MHRA has a guidance that came out in 2022 on risk-adapted approach to clinical trials and risk assessments. The question is that it's quite explicit of who participates and the expectations, and I don't know if we have any sense of, is there some convergence that we're seeing, they have their own guidance, but we're seeing with E6 and other guidances, or is there different approaches that may be making it challenging to sort of implement this approach across the board?
I personally think E6 and E8 are written in a way that actually provide the foundation on how we work. We will possibly never completely avoid to have something very specific on a country level. Mm-hmm. But overall, the alignment in the ICH working groups, and we very often have a broad contribution from all of the regions, from partners who are not one of the standing members, but also are some of the associated members. And this work actually leads to guidelines and wordings which are then internationally accepted. And I think that's the way we want to go from an ICH perspective. And therefore, I don't think you can absolutely avoid it, but I know the guideline, and I don't think the guideline is in contradiction to what we actually have out there from an ICH perspective.
And I would add to that from the work we're doing right now on addressing the comments in E6. I mentioned we received thousands of comments. MHRA is one of the key players in really providing input on how to address those comments to really move forward. And I believe everything we've been hearing is in alignment, at least, with the general concepts that MHRA would like to move forward with.
Great. Fergus, anything to add?
No, I think it goes for any legislation or guidance in one or other part of the world. You can look at it and pick apart the differences, or you look at it and say, these are almost identical in their purpose, in their intent, in their objectives. So the nitty-gritty detail, a lot of it's guidance anyway, so the nitty-gritty detail, it's guidance, and you can do things a bit differently or a lot differently depending. So I wouldn't read too much into differences in detail. I think the objectives are very much shared.
Great. Please introduce yourself, and is it on?
Thanks. Yeah, increasingly the FDA's guidances have encouraged more and more real-world data trials. Now, there have not been at the same time guidances on the clinical trial. At least I'm not a clinical trial expert, so I'm here to learn. But I was wondering, these various issues on monitoring, can you speak a little bit about how, with the increasing real-world data trials that are particularly observational and not pointedly interventional, because it's trying to collect data on a given, say, a device or a drug implementation, do the monitoring, because that's something our team struggles with, that we don't want to kind of somewhat over-engineer the trial and create a non-real world situation. I'd love some comments. Thanks.
Can we ask for a clarification? So you talked about real-world data within a trial and then also observational studies. So are you integrating the real-world data into a trial, or are we talking more about observational?
Thank you for that question. This is basically real-world data study, as in the sense that I'm saying it's not interventional, as in it's not pointedly asking for the trialist to do something different than otherwise that device or drug would be operated on. And I'm working on devices mainly. So when I say observational, as in the trial isn't asking to act upon the results from the information of, say, a diagnostic, for example. Mm-hmm. So in such a situation, how much data should one collect? Should we over-engineer and break the bank, if you will? Right?
You want to?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think in general, when you're comparing, for example, to approved medications, or you're comparing to a standard practice to each other, and you generate, in that setting, you're generating really healthcare data as part of that whole ecosystem. And we want general consideration of that specific trials. People come to us with questions about those kind of trials, and we discuss, what data need to be collected, understanding that context. So I would encourage communication. So it's not a strange situation for us. When you started the question, actually, I was thinking about the spectrum of the use of real-world data. So I was glad the clarification was added, because you can imagine real-world data being utilized in interventional clinical trials all the way to observational studies across the spectrum. In E6 Annex 2, we're trying to touch a little bit on the use of real-world data in the context of healthcare data specifically within interventional clinical trials. So hopefully we'll illuminate that a little bit. Again, E6 Annex 2 is high level, but hopefully we'll touch on that a little bit in that regard.
Yeah,
so stay tuned.
Yeah, and possibly Fergus has something to add, but I also think E8, because it's for clinical study, has a chapter also on secondary use of data and reuse of data, bringing that in as a design element and where to focus from the QBD, critical to quality factor. And I think QBD is actually a very valid concept there, because it is real-world evidence data. You really have to check on what are the criteria and what is be essential for the outcome and the study results. And I think therefore the methodology introduced is really useful. And I know it's a topic Fergus is also quite interested in, so I'm sure you have something to add on to that.
Just a couple of thoughts. I think we do need to think carefully about the use of, let's say, data that can be searched for and found in medical records in observational studies, and you may be looking historically or prospectively or both, but there's no direction from a protocol as to how that healthcare takes place. You just look at what's happening in hospitals and the community. On the other hand, with prospective interventional trials, you're directing certain elements of the treatment and data collection. But let's not forget, if you're on an oncology study, a lot of what's collected was being collected anyway. You just may be a bit more precise about the time point, or you may ask everybody to fill in one particular scale of symptoms or toxicity or whatever, whereas they may otherwise have done it a bit differently or do it at a certain time point. But you're still collecting stuff that was put into the medical record anyway, by and large. So we should be careful in thinking that there is a real world and there's what's done in clinical trials, and there's a huge gap between the two. It's a very great continuum. And secondly, don't collect more than you need. And especially with these digital tools now, you can collect an ECG every 25 seconds if you want. Don't do what you need, because otherwise the more you get, the more you'll have to deal with. And I've heard multiple times studies which are slowed down now at the analysis step because they've collected too much stuff. So it's, and I think the quality control processes for observational studies will be very different. You don't do monitoring as such, you have different ways of dealing with it.
Great. And I'd like to maybe end with another great question from our online audience, talking about the slow adoption of QBD and risk-based monitoring. They sort of attribute to a general all-or-nothing approach in a policy and SOP-driven industry. You have the SOPs and sort of changing them. And this really gets to this change management. And the question is really any advice on shifting this mindset? And I know our regulators are trying, so I'll turn it over to those who are really working within those companies of how do you change mindsets around this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's linked to any kind of initiative we want to implement in sponsor companies or the industry. How do we change the mindset? How do we link it to quality culture, to ownership, accountability? I think the best thing is to run successful pilots, and we're going to hear some of that this afternoon and later on, where people see that these kind of concepts, also early stakeholder engagement, enable a study which at the end was faster, more cost efficient, and provided higher quality than if we would have done it differently. And with these kind of success stories, I think that's what actually drives it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think demonstrating those success stories, bringing forward those case studies and sharing them as a group therapy for the industry is a way towards further embedding these types of practices more deeply and more consistently.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much to our panelists, to our speakers, to those in the audience and those online for all those great questions. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to reconvene at 10:45, and we'll start with QBD implementation data and those case studies.
There we go.